As we talk today, we're going to continue in the theme with Ephesians, and we're going to be in Ephesians Chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn there. If not, we will have it on the screen for you. As we bounce around, we're going to stay mainly in Ephesians 6 is where we're going to be for the bulk of our time, but we are going to bounce around, take a look at a couple other pieces of text that support what we are going to be talking about with the fundamentals of the family. And it was funny, as a few weeks ago, Steve and I were talking about this and talking about where we were going to be at this point in the series, and Steve said, hey, I want you to do this part, Ephesians 6, and I said, okay, and if you are unaware, if you haven't yet peeked at your Bibles, Ephesians 6 deals a lot with children, obey your parents, right? Children, obey your father and your mother, and we're going to get into all that in just a moment, but I took a look at my schedule, my calendar, where I was, and I was like, Steve, this is great. You are giving me this passage right after I come back from fall break at the beach with my family. And if you've ever gone to the beach with littles, this right here, whole message today is challenging to me as I reflected on my week with them, 3 of them running around, and me telling them over and over and over and over again to do things or not to do things, and it never seemed to work. So really, I told my wife that we could just show like home videos today for like 45 minutes straight of like, hey, this is what took place. This is how not to do it, because this is, I was filming everybody else's families, not mine. And my family had it down. But as we get into this idea of fundamentals of the family, and we take a look at the text in Ephesians 6, there's a couple of things that I want us to just grasp a hold of, to just understand, hopefully better for ourselves today. And if you're in the room today and you're saying, listen, Tyler, I don't have a kid yet, or hey, I'm an empty nester, or whatever the case may be, let me just stop you there before you check out, because the message today isn't just speaking directly to kids in obeying your parents or honoring your mother and your father. It is speaking to every person in this room today. And so before you say, nah, I'm out, just hang on, okay? Because we're going to get to you in just a few moments. All right, but as we take a look at today's text, before we get into the fundamentals of the family, there are a few things that we must set as guidelines or parameters for us. We first, as parents, must set an example for our children, okay? I know you say, Tyler, that's obvious, right? I get it. I don't know how many of you, I noticed this a ton this past week as I spent the week with my father and mother and then my own kids, and I would catch myself and I would notice the tendencies that I would say things or do things as my father does things. Anybody else in the room do those? So I can feel like I'm not alone. Okay, cool, thanks for playing along, all right? And so I would say these things or do these things, and it's these little quirky little phrases that my dad says. I can say that this service because he'll be in the next. But it's these little things that he does that I just pick up on and say. And what I've noticed is now my 8-year-old son, he says the same things and so at one point in the room, we're all sitting around and everyone is quiet, minding their own business. And here comes my dad waltzing into the room, says this little phrase, I say the little phrase, and then Liam says the little phrase. And it's one of those things that I took a look at this right here, and we as parents must set an example, a biblical example for our kids. The next thing that we need to do or to realize is that no one has more potential to influence your child than you. And I know you say, Tyler, we're in a totally different world today. You know, we deal with social media. We deal with all of the other influences, the outside influences that are there. And I hear you. But let me just tell you that 83% of the child's infancy and into the adolescent stages of life is spent inside the home. 83%. And so no one has more potential to influence your child than you do. What kind of an example are you setting? But, and this is where we get into everyone else, you are not the only influence your children need. I love this as we get ready to take a look at the text today, that it is so important for us to grasp and to understand, and this is where it comes into the context of all of those of you in the room who do not have kids of your own, or maybe you're an empty nester, or whatever it is that you want to call yourselves right now, but you say, I don't have to worry about this passage because I'm not there. No, you see, I watched last week as the Francis brought their baby up, Parker, and he is so cute. And I watched as the entire room stood and agreed to help raise that child in a biblical manner. You see, you do have a role. Whether you choose to believe it at this moment or not, you do have a role to fulfill inside of this context. So it is important that you realize as a parent that you are not the only influence that your children need, but not only that, that two combined influences will make a greater impact than just two influences. And this could be taken in one of two different ways. This could be mother and father, that you two together, all right, combining together with the same idea, same goal in the end of reaching our kids with the gospel of the good news of Jesus Christ and training them up, which we'll get to in a few moments, but making sure that they have the biblical foundations that they need. This could be the mother and father being on the same page. Can we just be honest for a moment as we're going to take a look in just a little bit at the text? Dads, we are not too good at this. You take a look at every podcast that's being downloaded on parenting, and the majority of the podcasts that are being listened to are by moms. You take a look at the parenting help books or the self-help books when it comes to parenting, and the majority of those are being purchased and read by moms. Because we as dads, and I'm the world's worst at this, we think that we have it figured out. Or at least we can fake it, right? But when we combine two influences, a mother and a father, or maybe those of you that are out here, maybe you're a single mother or a single father, and you combine your influence with what the church is offering. And I was talking to my wife yesterday on our should have been 7-hour trip back, but with 3 kids and one dad who has a really small bladder, it took about 8.5, 9 hours. And we were talking about this, and we were talking about as she gets to serve down in the kids ministry, we were talking about the whole idea of obedience and what that looks like for her down in her world with the kids. And it's a totally different picture than what I envision when I deal with students and teenagers. Because students and teenagers, I can tell them something, and they're either gonna listen or they're not, right? Most of the time they actually do listen. We got some very good students. But down there, like they will deliberately look you in the eye and do exactly the opposite of what you tell them to do. And so all of our kids down there are getting to partner with this combined influence of helping reach and raise the next generation. So today, as we take a look, children are watching how we obey God. And you'll see this in just a moment as we get into the text, as we take a look at this word obey, and what does the word obey mean? And we'll start with Ephesians 6, verse 1. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." And this word children here is used, and this is all the way from birth through the infancy stages, all the way up through the early adolescent and even the younger adolescent stages here. This is what children mean. This would be anyone from birth through, honestly, 17, 18 years of age. So children, obey your parents. Now this word for obey, right? It's one that we like to throw around left and right? Obey me because I'm dad. Obey me because I'm mom, and you're supposed to obey me. And we like to throw this word out, but really the meaning of this word, the definition of the word obey, is to really see someone in authority, or to give yourself up. So when I obey, I am to give myself up. Not my will, not the things that I want necessarily, because oftentimes, as I deal with students and teenagers all the time, and we talk about this concept, oftentimes the word obey, when our parents use it, or when they want us to obey, it is most oftentimes in the most inopportune time. We are right in the middle of getting ready to win the championship on our Xbox. And our parents tell us to take out the trash. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe it's in another context where you are not wanting to do something. Maybe you're watching a game or watching a video or participating in a talk of some sort. And right here, obey also, it means to obey immediately. That we're going to take a look at. Immediately. First time obedience. And so as we hear this, obey your parents. And those of you that are in the room that are maybe you say, I'm older, my parents are they're still here on this earth, but you know what? I'm an adult and I get to make my own decisions. Listen, I love that. I appreciate that. But just to put it into context, for me and how I was raised, and we're going to get into more of that, I was raised, and this is still true today. My dad and I were having a conversation the other day. He texted me, over the phone, and asked me a question. I responded with yes. And he texted back immediately and said, son, I'm still your dad. I text back, yes, sir. You see, I do things now in obedience because it has been trained up in me. I have been instilled with those values, and that is how I respond. And so let's take a look at this right here. It says, a child's obedience starts with a parent's training. A child's obedience starts with a parent's training. But let me say this. If you are expected to or want your children to obey what you are saying and to look at you in an authoritative way, then you first must look to your father in the same manner. But so often, right? So often it's my word or my way or the highway, right? Like I've got the final say-so in my house as we've been walking through Ephesians 6. And my wife, right? We guys, you remember this the other day, right? Throwing up the hands. Ladies, there were multiple times on the car ride. I'm astounded that I've been able to make it my entire life in driving without the help of my wife. It's amazing. You're all laughing because it happens. And there was one point, we're driving down the interstate. My wife says something. I take both hands off the wheel. So she very quickly, nope, put your hands back on, nope. A child's obedience, though, starts with a parent's training in the way that we decide to parent, in the way that we decide to raise up our children. They must see in us the way we look to our Father. They must see that relationship that we have with our Father and say, I want to imitate that. As we talk about setting an example for our children, I want my children to see that in their daddy. I don't want them to say, well, daddy was never around. Daddy missed this, daddy missed that. Man, I want them to see Jesus in me. First time obedience. Andy said down there in the kids that as they talk about this phrase, first time obedience and obeying right away, that's a concept that we use frequently in our house. Frequently in our house. We tell our boys, mainly our boys, to do something, and they kind of sit there for a moment, and then we use the phrase, obey right away. First time obedience. And more times than not, they get up and they immediately will go and do it after we use this phrase. And they will go and do as what we have asked them to do. But this down there is already being instilled in and ingrained into the life of our kids' ministry. And it's so good to hear that. As Andy and I were having this discussion on the way back up yesterday, she was talking about how they use this phrase often in all of the kids' classrooms. And it's so much so that they have taught the teachers who are down there. And some of you, many of you who are teachers down there, and you serve and volunteer, and thank you for that. But you know that you use this phrase down there. It's becoming a common theme. Obey right away. Based on your actions, will your child obey you unto life, or will they obey you unto death? Think about that just for a moment. Based on your actions, the way that you are setting an example and the things that you are doing, when God calls you to obey, we're not even getting into the text yet. When God calls you to obey, are you obeying what he's telling you to do? Because if not, then how do you expect your children to obey what you're telling them to do? Will they see you living like Jesus and obey you unto death or unto life? Or will they obey you unto death? Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord, is what Colossians 3:20 says. And then back to Ephesians 6:1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. This is in the Lord. This is the same that is found in Ephesians just a few verses ago, where wives, you are to submit to your husbands in the Lord. This is that same context there, used again for children. You are to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It tells them, hey, you are not to obey your parents necessarily because your parents are saying so, but because I, as God, have given your parents the authority to reign over you. That is why you are to do that, because this is right, because this pleases the Lord. That is why you are to do it. So if you are in here today and you are a child, if your parents are still living today, then you are still to obey your parents. Some of you, we choose to believe that, man, I turned 18, I'm dead and gone. I'm gone. I could be out of the house. I can come back when I want to, right? Looking at some of you dads, tap your college student on the arm. Don't do that. Everyone can see you. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. This is where it's found in Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. We are to do this as a commandment from the Lord. Ephesians 6:2, as we move on, honor your father and mother. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment. This is the first commandment with a promise. Notice it's here in verse 2. Paul begins to go behind the action and gets to the attitude. Obeying is an action. Honor is an attitude. And when he calls for us in verse 1 to obey your father and your mother, that is the action in which we do this. Honoring is the attitude in which we do this. How many times, parents in the room, you don't have to raise your hand even though I know what it would be. How many of you, I'll raise my hand, how many of you have told your kids to do something, all right, and they do it with this type of attitude? Anybody else in here? Okay. Few of us. Man, that's not very honoring. My boys are notorious for this. We've used this phrase a lot last week. Honor your father and your mother. Man, can I pause here for a moment? As we relate back to us being obedient to our father. This is the same thing for us when it comes to honoring our Father. See, we've been given the commandments. We've been told how to obey and where to obey and what to obey. But so many of us do it begrudgingly. So many of us walk off and throw that temper tantrum as I just did there. So many of us are like that kid in the cereal aisle at Kroger. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. Paul goes behind the action and begins to get into the attitude. And you see here in Exodus 20:12, he begins to blend and merge Exodus 20:12, and we take a look at the Old Testament coming into part of the New Testament. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. And then he continues, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. You see, in this day and age, as we're talking about who Paul is talking to here in the church at Ephesus, what he's speaking to is a people who would have been, the majority of them would have been parents. And majority of them would have been Christian parents. They would have understood this idea. And in that day, it was okay for a father, if he did not like what was happening with his kid, to punish his kid by killing them. And there was no punishment crime for such thing. That brings a whole new context into, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out of it. But here we see whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. It was a command. We see this promise here that this will take place. And then he continues in Matthew chapter 15, verse 4. For God commanded, honor your father and mother, and whoever rebels the father or mother must surely die. He says it again in this way in Matthew chapter 19, verse 19. Honor your father and your mother. It says it 5 other different times all throughout the New Testament. Paul combines Exodus 20, verse 12, and then in Deuteronomy chapter 5:16, he talks about the two and the promise that you have. And this isn't a promise that you will have your kids live a long and full life. We know that there are good kids who die young. This is not the promise of that. What this promise is saying is, for instance, if I were to tell my boys, don't run in the street or don't go play in the street, what I am telling them and what they are to obey is not to go in the street, because there are cars coming. There is danger that lurks in the road. If they stay in the yard and play, chances go way up in them surviving. But if I have my boys go play in the road, then chances go way down for them surviving. Chances are they could get hit by a car. And cars fly in our subdivision. Honor your father and mother. Listen to what they say. Obey them, but do so in such a way that brings honor to their name. This is what I want us to catch this morning. When we talk about the word honor, how many of us in this room, right, we struggle, maybe we don't necessarily struggle with the obedience part, we'll do that, but the word honor for us, it's hard. It's hard for us. Because to honor your father and mother is to do so with a grateful spirit, to do so with an attitude that is joyful. I cannot tell you the last time that I told my boys to take out the trash and they popped up and said, "Yes, Daddy, I wanted to take it out. Thank you so much for letting me take out the trash." Has anyone else ever experienced that? If you have, I need to get on the training program that you're in. Honor your father and mother. Do so with a glad spirit, a happy attitude. Ephesians 6:2, honor your father. This is the first commandment. We just talked about that. That it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. You see, God's promise there is both a blessing to your family and safekeeping on your family. That if you honor and obey what he is calling you to do, if your kids obey and honor what you have called them to do, then you will have a blessing and safekeeping. This is the first commandment that's seen here. The promise. Promises both of these, the blessing and the safekeeping. Exodus 20:12, as we just read, honor your father and mother that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And then Deuteronomy 5:16, honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. I want this for my kids. I want this for my family. I want them to be able to see Daddy living out in obedience to what God has called me to. And so then it turns in Ephesians Chapter 6, verse 4. And it says, fathers. Now, this term fathers, it could have meant parents. But me personally, I take this one to heart. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Man, dads, can I talk to you just for a moment, dads? Moms, you can close your eyes so you don't hear us. Dads, how many of us struggle with this and this? As the head of my house, my job is very clear here. That for me as daddy, I am not to provoke my kids to anger. And we're going to get into what that means in just a moment, but there are times, dads, where our kids test us. Amen? And oftentimes, you look at them and think, you are just like your mother. Do not provoke your children to anger. As we take a look at parenting, it's hard. Parenting with heart is even harder. Chip Dodd, one of our members here, is real famous. I'll say this because he's not here this week. He's on vacation, but wrote a book called Parenting with Heart. Phenomenal book. Incredible book. If you've never read it, I want to encourage you to read it. Parenting with Heart. I've got a copy in my office, multiple copies. If you want one, come see me. I'll get you a copy. But this whole idea of parenting with heart, he compares the idea of parenting, the idea of disciplining your kids, to a giraffe on ice. Just get that mental image for a moment. A giraffe walking around on ice. That's the image of parenting. There are going to be times we fall. There are going to be times we make mistakes. There are going to be times that we get it so wrong. Parenting is hard. Parenting with the heart is even harder. We are not to provoke our kids. We are not to make them angry with what we say. We're going to get into that. But do you want to know why it is so hard to discipline our kids? Why it is so hard to raise them up? Why it is so hard for us to be able to look at them and to tell them no or yes or do this or don't do that? Do you know why it is so hard for parents to, and why we struggle with this so much, and why we are oftentimes become complacent, or we let things go that we used to not let go, or we are try to reign with an iron fist here, but yet we're super lax over here? Do you know why it's so hard? This is why it's so hard. Look at those faces. This is why it's so hard. Like, Liam, like, the most, like, tender-hearted kid in the world. Like, I tell him no, and he immediately starts to get tears in his eyes. Like, I'm like, Liam, buddy, I was just saying no, like, don't tie your shoe like that. Like, it's okay. You can tie it however you want to. I don't care, right? Like, and then ain't nobody in their right mind telling her no. even though she probably needs it the most. She's in that stage right now that Andy was talking about, where she'll look at you and just be like, watch me. And I'm like, Andy, get your girl. But man, my HJ. This is why it's hard to parent. Because disciplining hurts. And I always heard my dad say, this is going to hurt me a whole lot more than it's going to hurt you. And I always said, well, then let me spank you. But now as a dad, it hurts me a whole lot more than it hurts them. And I can't help but to think and to wonder if this is how I feel about those three. How our Father in heaven feels about us when he has to discipline us. The difference is, there's a lot of times that I let them get away with things. Our Father in heaven is going to show us grace. He's going to show us love. He's going to show us mercy. If parents don't discipline their kids will discipline them. If parents don't punish their kids will punish them. I can say it that way. You know what I'm talking about. If you've ever been to an extended family gathering, maybe Thanksgiving or Christmas, and there's that kid over there, like your great uncle's niece, once removed, second cousin over there, who's sitting at the end of the table, and she won't stop crying or yelling or screaming. If you're in the room and you're trying to think of who that is, it may be you and your kids. All right, just a little. You're like, who in my family does that? Maybe you. But if we as parents don't discipline our kids, then our kids will discipline us. As we grow older, our kids won't listen to what we say because we've already given them so much free rein. Our kids won't respect us. They won't view us in an authoritative way or manner. And so they won't obey, nor will they honor us. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction. Again, here it is, of the Lord. This is the commandment that we have. Two challenges in raising our children. This is where I want to get to today and finish out with this. The first one is this: do not provoke them to anger. Dads, I wrote down a list. This is my list. You can fill in your own list. This was mine that I struggle with. So I wrote them down. I'm not going to put them on the screen for you. And as I wrote these, hurt. These are ways in which we provoke our kids to anger. Failing to take into account the fact that they are still kids. You see, kids don't come out with a willful and joyful attitude in one which they want to obey you. It has to be trained in them. It has to be disciplined into them. But we are to still take into the account that they are kids. Dads, we compare them to others. Our disciplining is inconsistent. We do one thing to one child, and our other child does the same thing or something similar, and we don't do it to them. Or maybe one day we discipline for something, and the next day they do the same thing, and we let it go. We are inconsistent. We fail to express approval. Earlier this week, I wrote on my Facebook and just threw it out there as some of the things that you as parents regret telling your kids or doing or saying to your kids. And the overwhelming majority of them was that you did not express your approval / you did not express your love to them. Over the small things, the small victories. My 6-year-old came out of the bathroom last night all by himself without asking me to check him. And I celebrated him like he had just won the Super Bowl. I picked him up. I ran him around the house. Yes! Do we celebrate our kids in the little things? Or do we expect them to live up to our standards and the things that we want and the goals that we put on them? Disciplining them for reasons other than willful disobedience or defiance. Pressuring them to pursue our goals, not their own. Hey, listen, I know that you were one step away from becoming the next Joe Montana. All right? He was a quarterback. All right, those of you that are looking. Hey. And I know that you want your kid to become the next Michael Jordan, LeBron James, or whoever. But have you ever thought that maybe your kid isn't as great in athletics, but maybe they're gifted in the arts? I don't know. Or vice versa. Or maybe your kids don't want to do any of that. Maybe they are just here to love on others, to serve others. It's so hard for us as parents. When Liam told me that he didn't want to play soccer, I grew up playing soccer, and he told me, Dad, I don't want to play soccer this year. He's never played in his life, but this year was going to be different, apparently. I don't want to play this year. Okay. I had to take a step back. Now, I know my son's giftedness. I know his own abilities, and he could be a good soccer player. He's got it. He's kind of got the frame. He sure isn't going to be a basketball player. But he said, Dad, I don't want to play soccer. I want to play baseball. And I coach soccer across the street, PCA, and he even told me, Dad, when I get older, I'm going to play for Coach Carter, Coach Kevin Carter, who's a member here. I'm going to play baseball for Coach Carter. I'm not going to play soccer for you. But I had to check myself. It's not what I want. As a dad, I'm supposed to be so supportive and champion my son. I'm not to provoke them to anger. Second thing, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. This is another phrase used in Colossians 3:21. Becoming discouraged. Have you ever seen this on your kid's face? That attitude of discouragement. That attitude of feeling or looking like a failure. Because of the pressures in which we put on them and place on them. Hopefully this doesn't happen to you. But we are not to provoke our children lest they become discouraged. And the second thing is this: bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bring them up. This is the same verb Paul used in Ephesians 5:29 in the sense of providing or nourishing or feeding. We are to bring them up in the discipline. We are to be in constant conversation with them about discipline and instruction of the Lord. Everything that we do and say is to be a reflection of what the Lord has taught us. We are to bring them up. Another word for this is to train them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The middle half, the Murfreesboro middle half, took place yesterday. I know there was many of you who probably ran it yesterday. Good for you. Hopefully you could have ran an extra for me. But in order for you to have ran that, the vast majority of you didn't wake up Saturday morning and say, oh man, let's go run a half marathon today. You would have trained for it. You would have done the couch to 5K and then moved on past that, more than likely. Some of you, you just could walk out and go run, and we all love you. Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Give them Jesus. Bring them up. Provide, nourish, feed. Train up a child is what Proverbs 22:6 says. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Oftentimes, we see this verse, we hear this verse, and we say, man, train up a child. Man, I'm going to send my kid to church. I'm going to send my kid to a private Christian school, and they're going to do all the training, and it's going to be great. I'm going to send them, I'm going to get them back, and they're going to be trained like we intend for our kids to be dogs that we send off to boarding. And when we get them back 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, that they're good and trained, and they're going to obey every commandment that I give to them. But we are to do the training up of a child. We as parents, we as fathers, we as mothers, we as the church are to be the ones that are training them up in such a way that even when they are older, they will not depart from it, because this is what they will know to be good and truth and right. We are to create a culture of unconditional love to fuel the emotional and moral health of our children. We are to train them up. Fathers should care for their children lovingly. We are to discipline and instruct them, and the way that we do that is to teach, counsel, admonish, warn, and punish. And we talked about this word punish, that discipline, and how it is so hard to discipline our kids. Growing up, my family, we had what was known as the paddle. Now listen, I'm not advocating to spank your kids, okay? Those of you are like, oh my goodness, he spanks. Okay, my family, we choose to give the rod. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we had a paddle. It was a wooden paddle. It was about this wide. It was about that long. It had a handle on it that my dad could get both hands around. And my dad drilled holes through it for aerodynamics. And it sat on a nail in the threshold between our kitchen and our living room. And in my family growing up, there were ways in which we responded, and every parent, every family is different. And when my dad would yell or call our name, no matter where we were in the house, no matter what we were doing, we were to stop and to respond with, yes, sir. And we would sit there. And if he didn't say anything else, it was because he didn't want to yell what he wanted us to hear. He wanted us to go to where he was. And so we would go in there to where he was, but sometimes he would just yell across the room. But if we did not respond with yes, sir, or if we responded with yes, sir, and then we would not make our way to where he was, you could hear his recliner pop down. You know what I'm talking about? The recliner popping down was about a 45-second head start. And then you could hear the paddle hitting up against the wood as he went to grab it off. Then you had about 10 seconds. You see, my dad was the one in our family who disciplined. Even when my mom tried one time, and I remember my brother and I both laughing after she punished us and gave us the paddle. And then we got even worse when my dad got home. You see, as we think about this, Hebrews 12:6 says, "For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives." So we think about punishment and how hard it is for the Father to punish us. to discipline us when we do things wrong. Proverbs 13:24 says, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. We use the rod in my house. The rod this is just a ruler. It's a little bit thicker. We use a wooden spoon. There was a time that us and Home Depot were on a first name basis because we had all the paint stirring sticks that they had. They're free. We had one in the backpack, one in the car, one in the truck, one in every room of the house. I carried one in my back pocket. We were on it. Kidding. Kind of. But in our house, we give the rod. It's what we do. And once we sit our kids down, right now our boys down, and we tell them, boys, this is why. This is why you are getting the rod. Because daddy has asked you, because daddy has told you. You see, we put it in an authoritative manner because this is why. Because daddy has asked you to do this. Daddy has told you to do this. Mommy has told you or asked you to do this. And you disobeyed. And by disobeying us, you disobeyed God. And the only way to get this foolishness and this selfishness out of your heart is for you to remember something by it. And that something is going to be the rod. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die, is what Proverbs 23:13 says. And if you strike him with a rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. Train up a child. Discipline your son, and he will give you rest. He will give delight to your heart. You see, if you start it now, if you begin to train up your child in such a way, then later on in life, he will give you rest. Just as my dad still texts me, and I respond back, yes, and quickly respond back, yes, sir. It has been trained up in me. I know how to treat not just my father, but elders. It's a respect thing. It's an honor thing. So in closing, give them Jesus. Give them Jesus. Funny story with Liam. Liam, when he was younger, could not say his R's, his rod. He couldn't say rod. You know, kids, younger, couldn't say it. And so we would oftentimes, when talking to Liam about why we are having to punish him, and after I said the phrase, son, this is going to hurt you a whole lot more than it's going to hurt me, I think that's like every dad's like first slogan they have to say. Pull out the rod. Talk to him about why I'm having to give him the rod. And I would give him the rod. And then as he would walk out of the room, oftentimes Andy would ask him, son, what happened? Liam would say, in his tears, I got God. In a lot of ways, that's my prayer. Is that my kids would get Jesus. Because of the example in which I am teaching and leading my kids. My prayer and hope is that you would be the same way. That your kids would look at you and see the obedience that you have for your Father in heaven. Or for those of you who are still living the way, that your parents are still living the way that you love and respect and honor your parents. And your kids will see that. Can we give them Jesus? Can our kids see Jesus in us? Every morning I get to take my boys to school. It's a quick drive, 5 minutes, 3.5 if we leave before Oakland traffic happens. But I make it a point, as they're talking about Pokemon cards and who won the Monday Night Football game and Kentucky lost again. in our car ride, we talk about Jesus. How often are you, as a parent, talking about Jesus in your house? It starts with you. Are you pointing them to Jesus?